I'm Natalia, 32, and I earned the Medal of Honor after 10 years in the Army, something no one in my family ever saw coming. For most of my life, I did everything they asked. Good grades, no trouble, always the reliable one. But when I enlisted, they cut me out of their lives, called me a disgrace, and meant it. That day, I made a choice I'd never take back. Have you ever been dismissed or rejected by the people you thought would always be there? Drop your story in the comments, I promise, you're not the only one. Before I get into it, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to walk away from someone who stopped seeing your worth, hit like and subscribe. Because what happened next, they never saw coming. My name is Natalia Freud. And for most of my life, I was exactly who they wanted me to be. My father, Dr. Leonard Freud, was a vascular surgeon with a reputation so meticulously managed you'd think he was running for office. My mother, Elise, gave up her concert pianist career when she had me, but she never gave up the belief that every move we made had to be perfect. If you didn't get into the right schools, didn't wear the right clothes, didn't speak the right way at the right events, you weren't just letting yourself down, you were embarrassing the family. We lived in a 5-bedroom colonial in West Hartford, Connecticut, on a tree-lined street where everyone's lawn looked professionally trimmed and every mailbox bore a name you were supposed to recognize. Our world wasn't about warmth. It was about presentation. I learned early how to perform, not on stage, but in life. Private schools, cotillion, classical cello, mock trial. By middle school, I had a GPA my parents could brag about at galas, and a vocabulary curated to impress their friends at dinner parties. My younger brother, Max, came along when I was 7, and from the beginning, he was nothing like me. He had no patience for polish. He got into fights at school, stopped wearing his uniform tie by 4th grade, slammed doors when they criticized him. My mother called it his phase. My father just ignored him. Whenever Max blew up, I was the one who buffered. I'd pick him up from the principal's office. I'd cover for him when he skipped piano practice. I'd talk my mom down when she spiraled, which happened more often than anyone outside our home knew. One year, when I was 14, my mom locked herself in the bedroom for 2 full days after Max got caught shoplifting from the mall. I sat with her the second night, in the dark, listening to her whisper about how she'd failed as a mother. My father was out of town at a conference. Or at least, that's what he said. I made dinner for Max. I cleaned the house. I kept everything running. No one ever asked me how I was doing. By high school, I was the one with the spotless transcript and a resume full of leadership roles. My parents made sure I knew what was expected: Ivy League, medical school, maybe law if I insisted on being difficult. But there was one thing I never said out loud, that somewhere deep down, I didn't want any of that. It started small. A school field trip to a local Air Force base. I remember watching the officers, the way they stood, the way they moved, the quiet confidence they had. They didn't seem to care about appearances. They cared about mission, about purpose. I started researching military careers in secret. Late at night, after homework, after practice. I told myself it was just curiosity. It wasn't. The more I read, the more something in me clicked. Structure, discipline, camaraderie, service. Not for the image, not for the applause, but because it meant something. By junior year, I knew. I didn't want a legacy. I wanted a life that was real. I started talking to a recruiter from the Army, pretending it was for a civics project. He asked me questions no one else ever had. Why did I want to serve? What kind of leader did I want to be? What did I want my life to stand for? The answers came faster than I expected. Still, I kept it quiet. I knew what would happen if my parents found out. They had spent my entire life grooming me for one version of success. The idea that I would trade Harvard for a pair of combat boots? It would have been unthinkable to them. So I played my part. I kept my grades up. I applied to every school they asked me to. I smiled through college tours and nodding conversations with alumni they introduced me to at parties. But in the background, I was filling out my application for West Point. When I got the acceptance letter, I didn't tell them right away. I remember the moment I held the envelope. Thick cardstock. The crest embossed in gold. My name printed neatly across the front. I ran my hand over the seal before I opened it. Congratulations. It was the first time in my life that a future felt like mine. When I finally told them, 2 weeks later, sitting across from them at the long dining room table they only used for guests, the room went completely silent. My mother was the first to speak. You're throwing away your entire future. My father didn't even look up from his plate. You will not do this, he said, calm and cold. You don't enlist. People like us don't enlist. I tried to explain that West Point wasn't just enlisting. It was an academy. It was a commission. He cut me off. You're not going to be some uniformed employee taking orders for a living. I didn't raise you for that. I said, quietly, it's leadership. It's service. He finally looked at me. It's disgraceful. Max was in the kitchen, listening. I could see his shadow near the doorframe. He didn't say a word. My mother pushed her plate away. Do you have any idea what people will think? What this will do to your reputation? 2 hours. That night, I packed a bag and drove to my aunt's house 2 towns over. She wasn't close with my parents, which was probably why she let me in without judgment. I stayed there until it was time to report. A week before I left, I got a letter in the mail. Certified. From a law firm I didn't recognize. It was a revision to my parents' estate plan. They were removing me. The letter was dry and professional, but the message was clear. I was no longer part of the family. They didn't just disapprove. They disowned me. No explanation. No phone call. Just a statement of erasure. I kept the letter. Not out of sentiment, but because I wanted to remember what it cost me to make my own decision. At West Point, I didn't talk about it much. A few people knew, my roommate, my squad leader. But most just assumed I came from the kind of family that sent daughters to service academies. I let them think that. Every time I laced my boots, every time I stood in formation, every time I pulled all-nighter studying tactics and leadership strategy, I thought about that dinner table. About the silence. About the word disgrace. And I told myself, not out of bitterness, but out of quiet certainty, I'll show you what disgrace really looks like. Because what I was building, what I was becoming, wasn't just a rejection of their version of success. It was a claim to something bigger. Something they never understood. And maybe never would. But I did. And that was enough to keep going. I still remember the first time I said it out loud. It was spring of junior year, and we were having dinner at a place my dad liked to take clients. One of those white tablecloth restaurants where everyone talks just slightly too quietly and the waiter corrects your pronunciation if you don't order in perfect French. We just finished talking about my SAT scores, and my mom was suggesting I apply early to Yale. I took a sip of water, steadying myself, and said, I've been thinking about doing ROTC. There was a pause, maybe 2 seconds. Then my father laughed. Not a full laugh, more like a short, amused exhale. You're kidding. I shook my head. I'm not. The silence that followed felt different. My mother set down her fork. My father just stared at me. You don't throw away everything we've built for that. I'm not throwing anything away, I said. It's still college. Just with military training alongside it. My mother's voice broke slightly when she spoke. Is this because of Max? Is this rebellion? That was the beginning. That night, they dropped me off at home and didn't say much else. But 2 days later, my mom showed up at school during lunch, asking to speak to the counselor. She told Mrs. Lambert that I was going through a reactionary phase and that they needed to adjust my course load to keep me academically focused. I found out because Mrs. Lambert pulled me aside and asked if I was okay at home. I said I was fine. I wasn't. That week, my parents stopped asking how my day went. Stopped checking in about midterms or study groups. They'd sit at the dinner table talking about Max's latest suspension and pretend like I wasn't there. When they did look at me, it was like they were waiting for me to come to my senses. When I brought home a first-place trophy from the state debate competition, they didn't say a word. It sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before I moved it to my room. The tension didn't escalate all at once. It was more like a slow rewiring. The way my dad would change the subject when someone brought up college. The way my mom would talk about Max's potential, like she was reminding herself she still had something to be proud of. She started asking if I'd considered softer fields. Psychology. Teaching. Anything that sounded like it would keep me safe. "You're not built for that kind of life," she said one night while we were loading the dishwasher. "What kind of life?" "You know what I mean," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Deployment. Combat. That's not who you are." "You mean that's not who you thought I was?" That earned me 3 days of cold silence. The deeper I got into the process, recruiter meetings, paperwork, fitness prep, the more withdrawn they became. Their friends started noticing too. At one dinner party, I walked past the living room and overheard Mrs. Cranston, one of my mother's oldest friends, say, "It's a shame. She had so much promise. But these kids, they get swept up in these delusions." My mother didn't correct her. She just offered a polite nod and topped off her wine. I knew I was losing them. But what surprised me was how quickly they seemed willing to let go. The same parents who used to micromanage my class schedule down to the half credit were now skipping my senior awards night without an excuse. My dad had a dinner. My mom claimed a headache. I walked across that stage alone, shook hands with the principal, and accepted a certificate for outstanding academic leadership while looking out into a crowd of strangers. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their applause. But it did matter. I just refused to let it stop me. Around that time, I started training early mornings with 2 other applicants who were also going for academy slots. There was a public park a few miles from the house, and we'd meet there just after dawn to run drills. My mom would peek out the window some mornings and watch me leave. Never said anything. Just stood there. One afternoon, I came home to find my acceptance letter to West Point open on the kitchen counter. The seal broken. My dad was in his office. I knocked once, then walked in. "You opened my letter." "It was addressed to this house," he said flatly. "I have every right." "You had no right to do that." He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "So, it's real now. You're really doing this." "I am." He stared at me like I was a stranger. "Well," he said finally, "don't expect us to be there when it falls apart." It didn't fall apart. I graduated top of my class. I passed every clearance, every exam, every fitness requirement. And I left home without a single family member wishing me luck. The night before induction day, I called my mom. She didn't pick up. I left a message anyway. "Hey, I just wanted to say thank you for everything. I know you don't understand this decision, but I hope one day you'll see why it mattered to me. I'm heading out tomorrow. Love you." She never called back. A few weeks later, a friend from home texted me a photo from our local newspaper. It was a charity gala. My parents were in the photo, smiling, arms around each other, next to a caption that said, "Dr. and Mrs. Freud support local academic excellence." Beneath the image, a quote from my father: "We've always believed that higher education is the key to a stable and impactful life." I stared at that sentence for a long time. No mention of me. No hint that their daughter had just started her journey at one of the most rigorous leadership institutions in the country. They talked about excellence, but not the kind I was building. When commissioning day finally came, crisp morning, polished boots, gold bars waiting in a velvet box, I scanned the crowd one last time, hoping. They weren't there. A sea of proud parents held flowers and signs, hugging sons and daughters in their new uniforms. Tears, laughter, congratulations echoing across the field. I stood with my platoon, still, silent, focused. My commanding officer handed me my insignia and shook my hand. "Well earned," he said. That was the only affirmation I got that day. And maybe the only one I needed. Because even though my parents couldn't see it, something had shifted. Not just in my status or my uniform, but in my understanding of who I was and who I wasn't living for anymore. They were already gone. All that was left now was the mission. It had been 2 years since I left for West Point, and during that time, my parents had gradually shifted from silent disapproval to complete absence. We hadn't spoken since the day I left. I mailed them one letter during my first semester, just a short update, polite, careful, the kind you might send an acquaintance out of obligation. I never got a response. By the time I graduated and received my commission, I had stopped expecting one. Still, when I received deployment orders after completing Ranger School, I felt something shift inside me. Like it deserved acknowledgement. Not pride. Not support. but at least recognition. I was being sent to Afghanistan. It wasn't unexpected, but it was still sobering. I called home the day I got the news. The number hadn't changed. It rang 3 times before my father answered. "Hello." "It's me," I said. Long pause. "I got my first set of orders." Silence again. I could hear the quiet hum of a television in the background. "Afghanistan," I added. He didn't say anything for a while. Then finally, "You made your bed." Click. He hung up. I didn't call back. Deployment was a blur. I was stationed near Kandahar. Our unit was tasked with logistical support and security coordination, but it wasn't long before we were pulled into direct response. Convoy protection. Village mediation. Late-night IED sweeps. I saw more in those 7 months than I had in the first 22 years of my life combined. We lost 2 men. I earned a Bronze Star for an action I still don't talk about. All I'll say is that we were ambushed on a night convoy. We took fire from 2 sides. One of our trucks went down hard. There was a decision point, stay or move, and I made the call to double back with 1 other soldier. I don't remember being scared. I remember being clear. We got the injured out. We secured the area until backup arrived. I don't remember much else, just the heat, the shouting, the feeling of time going thin and sharp. When I came home, I walked off the plane with a cane and a fresh scar across my left shoulder. They told me it would fade. The metal sat heavy in my gear bag. I didn't know where else to go, so I went home. Not out of hope. Just habit. I hadn't told them I was coming. I didn't want the rejection twice. But when I pulled into the driveway, my mom was outside trimming the hedges. She turned and looked at me like I was a stranger. "You're back," she said, flatly. "For now." I walked up the steps and she didn't move to hug me. She opened the door and let me in, then disappeared into the kitchen. The house looked the same. Too clean. Too quiet. At dinner, they made grilled salmon and steamed vegetables. It felt more like a restaurant than a homecoming. No one asked how I'd been. No one asked about the limp or the scar. My father sat at the head of the table and unfolded his newspaper like it was any other Tuesday. I tried. I told them about the village near Panjwai. About how the kids there used to wave at our convoy every morning. How one of them drew a picture of me with a stick figure smile and a cardboard shield. I told them about losing Sergeant Collins. About holding the radio that called in the medevac. My mother dabbed her lips with a napkin. "That sounds intense," she said. My father didn't look up. "You should have stayed in school." I stared at him. "You had everything going for you," he continued, folding his paper slowly. This was a detour. A waste of potential. I didn't respond. He reached under the table and pulled out a manila envelope. Slid it across to me like a check at the end of dinner. "What's this?" "Legal documents," he said. "We updated our will." I didn't open it. "You're no longer included." My mother kept her eyes on her plate. She wasn't chewing. Just waiting. "You're cutting me out," I said. He nodded. "You've made your choice. Now we're making ours." I wanted to ask why. But I already knew. "You're a disgrace to this family," he said. The words were so calm, they barely sounded like an insult. More like a fact. A diagnosis. My jaw tightened. I slid the envelope back toward him. "I don't want your money." He didn't touch it. "Don't contact us again," he said. I looked at my mother. She didn't say anything. So I stood up, picked up my bag, walked out the same front door I had walked through 1,000 times before. Except this time, I wasn't just leaving a house. I was leaving any illusion that these people were still my family. I drove to a motel 2 towns over and stayed there for the night. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat on the bed with the envelope still in my hand, unopened. Later, I'd give it to a friend of mine who worked JAG. He confirmed it. Cut out completely. I didn't tell anyone else. Not right away. When my CO asked if I was okay, I said I was. When my squad mates threw me a small welcome home barbecue, I smiled and thanked them. No one needed to know that the people who raised me had just erased me from their lives over dinner. A few weeks later, I mailed the Bronze Star citation to myself. Just to see what it felt like. It arrived in a plain envelope. No ceremony. I read it once, then tucked it into a drawer. The words felt empty. Not because they weren't earned, but because I knew that, to the two people who were supposed to care most, they didn't mean anything. To them, I was still the same disappointment I had been the day I walked away from their vision of success. Except now, they had the paperwork to make it permanent. I didn't try again. Not after that. I had finally understood there are some things more permanent than silence. Legal documents. And the cold clarity of a parent who chooses reputation over their own child. So I stopped looking back and started building forward. I returned to my unit that same week. No ceremony. No transition period. Just packed a bag, got on a flight, and rejoined my team like nothing had happened. No one asked why I'd come back early from leave. They knew better. In the barracks, I unpacked slowly, piece by piece. My cot was still made from the last time I left. Someone had kept it neat, probably Rivera. He was always tidying things. I didn't talk about what happened with my parents. Not in the beginning. Except with one person. Sergeant Melanie Cho. We'd served together on my last deployment. She was 5 years older than me, sharper than anyone I knew, and had a kind of brutal honesty that made her impossible to lie to. We were in the motor pool late one night doing a post-check on one of the Humvees when she looked at me and said, "You've been quiet." Not the normal quiet. The brittle kind. I didn't answer right away. Just kept tightening bolts. Finally, I said, "They cut me out." "Who?" "My parents." She didn't flinch. Just kept working. Then, casually, "You didn't lose anything." "They did." That was it. No pity. No follow-up questions. Just that one sentence, sharp and clean. Like she was cutting away the rot with a scalpel. I didn't cry. Not that night. But later, in the back stairwell of the training building, I sat down on the concrete, rested my head against the wall, and let the weight of it hit me. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was grief. Not the kind you shout about. The kind you carry. Because losing people who are still alive is a special kind of hollow. For a while, I kept telling myself they might come around. That one day I'd get a letter. A voicemail. Something. But weeks passed. Then months. Nothing. And after a while, I stopped waiting. I didn't delete their number. But I didn't use it either. Holidays came and went. I sent no cards. They didn't either. In their eyes, I no longer existed. So I started living like I didn't need them to. At first, everything felt mechanical. Train, lead, debrief, repeat. But somewhere in all that motion, something began to shift. The men and women I served with, the ones who stood beside me in places too dangerous to name, they became something else. Not coworkers. Not colleagues. Family. Not because we said it. But because we didn't have to. Because when rounds started flying, no one asked what school you went to or whether your parents approved of your life choices. They just asked if you had their back. And I did. Every time. Cho became my closest friend. We deployed together 3 more times. She had a way of spotting when things were off without making a show of it. When I got a mild concussion from a training accident and tried to brush it off, she cornered me in the hallway and said, "You can't lead anyone if your brain's rattling like a soda can." When a letter from an old high school friend showed up, the first piece of mail from home in years, she handed it to me without a word. She never asked what it said. It was short. A wedding invitation. I didn't go. But I did write back. Briefly. "Congratulations. Hope it's everything you dreamed of. Natalia, I didn't sign it with love." I wasn't sure I had any left for that version of my life. I built a different kind of rhythm over the next few years. One that didn't include birthdays or family reunions or holiday plans. Instead, it was patrol schedules, field briefings, deployment rotations. And in that structure, I found something my old life never gave me. Clarity. Every promotion felt earned. Every mission meant something. And when things went wrong, because sometimes they did, we didn't sweep it under the rug or pretend it didn't matter. We sat in a room, called it out, fixed it. There was no room for denial in our world. Only truth. Over time, I started mentoring younger soldiers. Ones who came in with similar stories. One girl, Private Mackenzie, told me during a late-night watch shift that her dad hadn't spoken to her since she shaved her head for basic. He said I looked like a convict, she said quietly. Said I embarrassed the family. I looked at her for a long time. Then said, my father told me I was a disgrace the day I came back with a Bronze Star. She blinked. Then laughed. Guess they don't get it. No, I said. They don't. But we did. That was enough. I still thought about them sometimes. Not every day, but in moments. When I'd hear a piece of classical piano on the radio, or when someone mentioned Connecticut winters. Sometimes I'd remember things I hadn't thought about in years. My mom teaching me how to fold linen napkins into swans for dinner parties. My dad letting me sit in the back row of his lectures at the hospital, scribbling notes in a notebook I didn't understand. They weren't always cruel, but they were always conditional. And when I broke the condition, they disappeared. That's the part that stayed with me. How quickly love turned into silence. But eventually, even that faded. I kept deploying, kept leading, kept surviving. And the life I built without them started to feel like the only one that was ever truly mine. No one handed it to me. No one paved the road. But every mile was mine. And every scar earned. By the time I hit my 10th year in uniform, I'd been promoted 3 times, led dozens of operations, trained hundreds of soldiers. And not once had I looked over my shoulder wondering if they'd be proud. Because I already knew the answer. And it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything. Not to them. Not to anyone. Just to myself. That I could lose everything I thought defined me and still become someone worth being. Not in spite of the loss, but because of it. 10 years in, my life looked nothing like the one my parents had mapped out for me. I wasn't a surgeon. I didn't own a house in Connecticut or attend fundraisers in tailored blazers. I didn't have a spouse in finance or weekends spent on the Cape. But I had something else. I had command. Respect. A record built on more than performance reviews and reputation. It didn't happen all at once. My career unfolded quietly, in places that don't make headlines, places where decisions are fast, stakes are high, and recognition is rare. But every mission built something. Every loss shaped something. I never sought medals. I didn't hang my commendations on walls. But I remembered every name, every face, and every call I'd ever had to make, the ones that meant someone wasn't going home. That's what made the nomination feel strange. I wasn't expecting it. My CO pulled me aside after a field exercise in Germany. We were still in gear, dirt on our faces, adrenaline fading from the last scenario. He handed me a manila folder. Inside was a packet I wasn't prepared for. Nomination, Medal of Honor. I stared at it for a long time. He said my name softly, gave me a nod. It's real. The mission they were referring to had happened almost a year earlier. Classified at the time. A hostage extraction in Syria. High stakes. Intel was spotty. We went in on limited notice. One of our birds was hit mid-infill. I ended up on the ground with half the team pinned down, the others cut off completely. The decisions I made over the next 3 hours still keep me up some nights. But the hostages survived. So did most of my team. One didn't. Corporal Nathan Ellis. 24. Smart, fast, and always first on the radio. He bled out on the evac bird holding a photo of his little sister. I didn't feel heroic. I felt responsible. Still do. But somewhere, someone wrote the report. The nomination went through the chain. And now, here it was. I didn't call anyone. Didn't post anything. Just folded the paper and put it in my locker. That night, I sat on my bunk and thought about the other envelope. The one for my father. The will. The sentence. You're a disgrace to this family. It had been almost a decade since I heard his voice. But the words still sat in the back of my mind like a film that never quite fades. At the time, I told myself I didn't need their approval. And mostly, I didn't. But this moment, this strange, surreal recognition, brought up something I hadn't felt in years. Not longing. Not regret. Just a quiet, unresolved echo. I didn't reach out. Not even when the official notice went public. The Department of Defense issued a press release. Full name, rank, unit, photo. It circulated fast, faster than I expected. By lunch, it was on military news sites. By dinner, CNN. I had 2 missed calls from reporters. One from a woman I'd gone to high school with. Her message was awkward. Congratulations. Would love to do a piece. Can't believe it's you. I deleted it. The next morning, our unit public affairs officer pulled me aside. He said a reporter from the New York Times had reached out. Not about the mission. About my family. They declined to comment, he added. I didn't ask how they got in touch. I didn't need to. That was the first time I knew they knew. They'd seen it. Read it. Recognized the name. Maybe even saw the photo. And still, silence. No call. No message. No letter. For years, I had imagined different versions of this moment. The day they'd find out who I had become. The rank. The record. The service. In some version, my father would be forced to admit he'd been wrong. My mother would cry. They'd ask for a second chance. But the reality was quieter. They just stayed invisible. And, honestly, it hurt less than I thought it would. The space they left in my life had already been filled. By people who mattered. Cho flew in a week later. She showed up in jeans and a leather jacket, carrying a six-pack and a bag of old photos from our first deployment. You always said you didn't want a spotlight, she said, cracking a beer. Guess the universe didn't care. I smiled. We sat in my apartment, flipping through grainy pictures. Sand. Humvees. Faces we remembered and some we tried not to. She asked if my parents had called. I said no. She didn't push. But she did say something I wasn't expecting. You know, she said quietly, this medal doesn't just mean you survived. It means the choices you made, the ones they disowned you for, were right. Not because you got a medal, but because people are alive who wouldn't be otherwise. That matters more than their silence. I didn't reply, just nodded. Because she was right. There are some moments in life where the scoreboard becomes clear. This was one of them. I didn't need my father's validation. I didn't need my mother's tears. All I needed was what I had already built. The ceremony date was set for the following month. My commanding officer asked if I wanted a guest list. I said no. He asked if I wanted to invite family. I paused, then said, the people who need to be there already are. I didn't say their names. Didn't need to. Because when the day came, the medals, the cameras, the speech from the president, none of that felt like the climax. What mattered were the faces I knew in the front row. Cho. Rivera. Lieutenant Foster. Even Mackenzie, now a sergeant herself. People who had seen the worst of me and stood by anyway. That was my family. And as the medal was placed around my neck, heavy and still warm from the box, I didn't think about what I'd lost. I thought about what I'd built. And who I'd become when no one was watching. The girl they called a disgrace. Now standing on a national stage. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove myself right. It was almost 3 weeks after the ceremony when I got the message. I was off-grid for a while, decompression protocol. No press, no schedule, just quiet. I'd taken leave upstate, borrowed a cabin from someone in our unit. The kind of place where your phone barely works and the nights are actually dark. I wasn't trying to disappear. I just needed air. Most of the congratulatory messages had come through already by then. People I'd served with, former instructors, even a couple of officers I barely remembered from early postings. My CO had said they'd filter any media requests, but I kept my phone off most of the time anyway. The message came in the form of a voicemail. Landline. No caller ID. The voice on the other end was scratchy, older. Hi, Natalia, it's Mrs. Garland. I'm not sure if you remember me. We lived 2 doors down from your parents back in West Hartford. I just wanted to say I saw the news. You looked incredible. Your mother was outside when it aired. Sitting on the porch. She cried. I don't think she knew anyone could see her. Your father, he didn't say a word. Just stared at the screen. Anyway, I thought you'd want to know. She hung up without saying goodbye. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after that. Not because I didn't know what to feel. Because I knew exactly what it was. Vindication. Not the loud, triumphant kind. The kind that settles in your bones. Quiet. Heavy. They saw it. The uniform. The podium. The medal. Me, standing next to the President of the United States. For 10 years, I had no idea if they even thought about me. Now I knew. They remembered. And for once, they couldn't look away. No edit button. No spin. Just the truth. On every screen in the country. I didn't call Mrs. Garland back. Didn't feel the need. But I listened to that voicemail 3 times before deleting it. Not because I needed the words. Because I needed the moment. For once, they had to sit in it. The silence they built. The daughter they disowned. Now honored in front of the nation. I kept thinking about that dinner table. The envelope. My father's voice when he said, "You're a disgrace." And now, after everything, the disgrace was being broadcast to every home in America, except this time, he couldn't control the narrative. I heard from a few more people after that. An old teacher emailed me. Said my mother had stopped by her house, by accident, a few days after the ceremony. Spoke in circles for half an hour. Never mentioned my name. But cried when she left. One of my high school classmates reached out on social media. Your dad looked stunned. We were watching at the bar, and someone had to tell him to sit down. I didn't respond to any of them. I just let the silence do what it does best. Expose things. Break patterns. Make people squirm. It's funny how long it took for the consequences to land. I had spent so many years wondering what it would take. What would finally make them see? Turns out, it wasn't the deployments. Or the Bronze Star. Or the years I held teams together in places they couldn't pronounce. It wasn't the leadership roles, the citations, or the loss. It was the public recognition. A camera. A medal. A stage. I used to resent that. But by now, I understood it. People like them don't respond to personal growth. They respond to spectacle. And this one, they couldn't ignore. I don't know what they said to their friends. Maybe they spun a version. Claimed we were estranged, but hoping to reconnect. Maybe they said nothing. Maybe they're still sitting in that same silence, just on the other side of the screen. I do know that their world changed that day. Not because I won something. Because they lost the ability to deny it. I was never the failure. They were. And now everyone knew. There's no estate plan that erases that. No folded napkin or piano recital that can distract from what the whole country saw. A daughter they cut out of their lives, standing where they never thought she'd be. I went back to base a few days later. The moment had passed, but the weight of it lingered. People looked at me differently. Some with respect. Some with awe. Some with questions they didn't know how to ask. I kept doing my job. Command doesn't pause for media cycles. One of my younger officers pulled me aside after briefing. He asked how it felt. The ceremony, he said. The medal. All of it. I thought for a second. Then told him the truth. It felt like a full circle closing. But not the kind where you go back. The kind where you finally understand why you left. He nodded like he understood. But he was 23. He hadn't lived it yet. Still, I appreciated the question. Because it reminded me that the recognition wasn't just mine. It belonged to every soldier who chose service over safety, over comfort, over family expectations. And it proved something I'd always believed, deep down. You don't need a perfect past to build a meaningful future. You just need the will to keep going. And the clarity to know who you are, even when no one else does. A few nights later, Cho and I sat on the base roof, drinking bad coffee and watching the lights from the flight line. She asked if I ever thought about calling them. I shook my head. I don't want an apology that's only happening because the cameras showed up. She didn't argue. She knew. Instead, she said, sometimes the best revenge is just letting them watch. And that's exactly what they did. Watched. While the girl they tried to erase rewrote the story. Without them. It came in a plain envelope with no return address. Postmarked from Hartford. I almost didn't open it. It sat on my desk for a few hours, tucked between training schedules and a box of challenge coins someone had mailed over from command. Eventually, I picked it up. Not out of curiosity. Just to get it out of the way. Inside was a single piece of cream-colored stationery. No salutation. Just a few lines written in a handwriting I hadn't seen in a decade. We saw the news. We hope you're safe. You made your point. No signature. But I didn't need one. I knew the handwriting. The way the capital letters leaned slightly to the left. The missing periods. The loop on the Y. It was my father. I read it once. then again. Then put it down. Not out of shock. There was nothing shocking about it. It was exactly what I expected from him, restrained, controlled, never vulnerable. An acknowledgement that came years too late and still managed to avoid the one thing that might have mattered: accountability. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even really a gesture. It was a notification. Proof that he'd seen me. Proof that they couldn't deny it anymore. But no real ownership of what they'd done. No mention of the dinner table. The envelope. The sentence that drew a line through our relationship and called it permanent. Just a line about me, making my point. As if this had all been a stunt. As if 10 years of service, sacrifice, and survival had been some elaborate rebellion. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so hollow. I didn't write back. I didn't even think about writing back. There was no part of me that wanted to reopen that door, not even a crack. Because I finally understood that some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed again. Some closures come without conversation. And this was one of them. Still, something about that letter settled something inside me. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel hurt. I felt clean. Like I had finally put down something heavy I didn't realize I was still carrying. All those years, I thought I'd moved on. Built a new life. But part of me had still been holding that silence, gripping it too tightly, like if I let go, the truth would somehow slip away with it. Now, I didn't have to grip anything. The truth had been seen. By them. By the world. And by me. I tucked the letter into a drawer I rarely opened. Not out of sentiment. Just to keep it somewhere real. Proof that even when people don't say what you deserve to hear, they still know what they did. A few days later, I told Cho about it. We were grabbing lunch on base, cafeteria trays, shipped coffee mugs, the usual. I mentioned it halfway through a story about a new lieutenant who kept mispronouncing acronyms. She stopped mid-bite. They wrote you. Just him. What did it say? I repeated the lines. She shook her head. That's not a letter. That's a memo. I laughed. First time I'd laughed about it. It felt good. Later that week, I got a care package from Mackenzie, now stationed overseas. Inside was a photo from one of our joint trainings years back. Me, Cho, Rivera, and Mackenzie standing in front of a transport, gear half on, all of us covered in dust. On the back, she'd written, "For the wall of real family." I pinned it up next to a framed letter from one of the hostages we rescued. He'd written to say thank you. Said he still had nightmares, but when he woke up, he remembered my voice telling him he was safe. That letter meant something. Because it came from truth. From pain. From a place that understood the cost of things. The one from my father? That was just paper. By then, word had gotten around. Other people started asking if I'd heard from them. I kept my answers short. Yeah, briefly. Doesn't change anything. Because it didn't. It couldn't. When you cut someone out of your life and seal it with legal ink, there's no walking it back with 3 vague sentences and a postmark. Some people say you should always be open to reconciliation. That blood is thicker. That time heals. But I've learned that time doesn't fix everything. It just gives you space to decide what's worth rebuilding. And for me, that foundation was gone. Not scorched. Just irrelevant. I didn't hate them. That was the surprising part. I thought I would. But hate requires energy. And I wasn't spending any more of mine on them. I had people to lead. Teams to train. Soldiers who needed someone steady in their corner. They got my time. My presence. My loyalty. Not 2 people who chose pride over their own child. I never got another letter. No call. No follow-up. Just that one note, folded into silence. And that was fine. Because I was done waiting. Done hoping. Done carrying weight that didn't belong to me. For the first time, I felt like I'd come full circle, not because the relationship had been repaired, but because I no longer needed it to be. I had already built something better. With people who showed up. Stayed. Served. And stood by me, not because they had to, but because they chose to. And in the end, that choice mattered more than any bloodline. More than any apology that never came. More than any memory of who they once were. Because family, I've learned, isn't just who raised you. It's who raised you up when the world tried to push you down. And I'd found mine. The ceremony didn't change who I was. It didn't erase the years I'd spent in combat zones. It didn't rewrite the choices I made or soften the silence my parents left behind. But it did change something else, something subtle. How the world saw me. Suddenly, people who had never spoken my name before were saying it on live television. I started getting letters from cadets, from high schoolers thinking about enlisting, from young women who'd been told the same thing I had once been told: don't waste your life on that. They thanked me for proving you could serve with honor and still keep your voice. One of them wrote, "I showed your story to my dad. He finally said I could apply." That one stayed with me. Not because it praised me, but because it reminded me that stories can build bridges, even in places where words used to be weapons. I was invited to speak at a leadership summit 2 months after the ceremony. A room full of officers, analysts, and policymakers. They asked for a keynote. I gave them my truth. I told them about my first day in uniform, about the disbelief in my parents' eyes, about being told I was a disgrace before I'd ever failed, and about what it meant to lead, not with bravado, but with integrity. When I finished, the room stood. Not because of me, because they recognized something universal. That honor isn't inherited. It's chosen. I gave more talks after that. At academies. On bases. Even once at the Pentagon. Each time, I spoke about the cost of conviction. What it means to be steady when everything around you shifts. To keep your compass true even when no one else thinks you're heading in the right direction. But the moment that stayed with me the most, the one I still think about sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, wasn't one of those speeches. It was right after the medal was placed around my neck. The cameras had just stopped flashing. The applause was still fading. And the president leaned in, just slightly, and said in a voice only I could hear, "You make this country proud." It wasn't for show. He didn't have to say it. But he did. And I believed him. Not because of who he was. Because of who I'd become. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just nodded. Because in that moment, something shifted permanently. It didn't erase the pain. Didn't undo the past. But it replaced it with something bigger. With something mine. For so long, I thought legacy was what other people allowed you to have. What they stamped with approval. What they passed down. But I was wrong. Legacy isn't about acceptance. It's about endurance. It's about what you stand for when no one is clapping. When no one is watching. When no one is calling to check in. That's when it's built. And that's what I stood on that stage holding. A life carved out of refusal. A path cleared by choosing what was right over what was easy. In the months after the ceremony, there were more messages. Some I answered. Some I didn't. I stayed in service. I always knew I would. I wasn't done. There were still leaders to develop. Still soldiers to guide. Still missions to run. But I also learned how to slow down, just a little. I started writing again. Not for publication. Just for clarity. Late nights, I'd sit in my quarters or a quiet corner of a rec room and write about things I'd never spoken out loud. About Mackenzie and Cho. About the convoy ambush in Kandahar. About the silence that followed my parents' letter. And about the medal, not as a prize, but as a marker. Not of arrival, but of survival. I still have that envelope tucked in a drawer. The one from my father. I don't read it. But I don't throw it out either. Because it reminds me that what we survive doesn't define us. How we carry it does. Every now and then, someone still asks if I ever think about reconnecting. My answer is always the same. I don't need to. The life I've built, the people I've chosen, that's the family that counts. And I'm proud of it. Proud of every mile that got me here. Not because it was easy, but because I did it anyway. Without applause. Without permission. And that's what I want people to know. Not just about me, but about themselves. That even when the people who should have loved you the most walk away, you still get to become someone worth knowing. Worth remembering. Because the best kind of legacy isn't the one you inherit. It's the one you earn. And I earned mine. Every step. Every scar. Every silence. So no, I don't need their pride. I don't need their name. I've got my own now. And it's enough. That's my story, but I know I'm not the only one. Have you ever been cut off for choosing your own path? Did they ever regret it? And if they reached out, Would you even want to hear it? Let me know in the comments. I'd really like to hear what you'd do. And if this resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder. You don't need their permission to be proud of who you are.